We're very thrilled to be today at York College talking to brickwork students. It's a great privilege for us. My name's Simon Hay. I'm the CEO of the Brick Development Association. So the first thing that we look at, what's the standard? And the standard is a harmonised European standard. That means it's the same across the whole of Europe. And that's EN 771 Part 1. That is the standard for clay bricks. And all your bricks that you get now will be made to them. In fact, it's not possible to buy a brick that's not made to EN 771 Part 1. The other interesting thing up there is PAS 70, Public Available Specification 70. Not a particularly interesting or well-written standard, actually, but it's very important to you because it defines what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable. One of the things it does say in there, for instance, which is very important when you come to disagreements and discussion on site, is where do you view a brickwork panel from? And of course, we see from PAS 70, you view a brickwork panel from 10 feet away. The most important thing you do when you start a brickwork job is to build the reference panel. You may have an argumentative and disputous designer. You may have a difficult client. You may have a difficult main contractor. And if you guys can say, look, before we start, the correct thing to do is to build a reference panel. We will build, as you see, this reference panel here is quite complex. It's got a number of features. It's got a larger a clay block, a fireborn in this case. It's got a corbel. It's got additional details. It's quite complicated, and actually that's the right thing to do. You should build in the complexity that you're going to build in the job actually in the reference panel. And what you're going to do with this reference panel, you're going to discuss the standard, you're going to depict the standard you're going to be building to, you're going to be showing the joint that you've chosen, and you're going to be showing the colour of the mortar. And all these things are shown here. So when a difficult client who perhaps doesn't want to pay you says, I'm sorry mate, your brickwork isn't up to my standard, I'm not paying you, you're able to point to your brickwork stand, your reference panel, and say, this is the standard that we agreed, and that is what I have achieved. Of course, if you don't achieve up to that standard, that's another question. And the other thing is you've got to look after your base materials. You do have to make sure that the bricks, when they arrive, they're level, they're on a good piece of site. You don't, when you cut the bands containing bricks, you cut them with something that's suitable. You don't whack them with a chisel and a hammer, break them up so they all tumble everywhere. It's obviously much harder now to lay these bricks. Some of them will be chipped. Many of them will get damp and wet. And when we build them into the wall, they may then suffer from efflorescence. And that could be a problem. You may then find yourself in remedial work. You might have to subsequently cut bricks out. So this is perhaps a rather an idealised situation, but this is a perfect situation for storing bricks. Good level ground, easy to get to it. They're protected from the weather. They're not going to get soaked, which obviously is going to make them harder to lay and could cause efflorescence and other issues. Perfect situation. So the other thing that we also have to know, which I know you guys probably already know, and it can be very hard to achieve, is we do have to mix samples from 3 separate piles of bricks into a 4th one, and that's the one we build for. And if we don't, there is a danger that we end up with a patterning of brickwork, which is actually unacceptable. Does anybody know what the obvious solution is? We've built a wall, it's all blotchy. What are we going to do that we can do? Well, we wouldn't render it because we're brickwork people and we've got planning permission for brickwork. So unfortunately, that wouldn't conform to our planning permission. There is a third alternative. You could have done it though. There is a third alternative. Does anybody know what that is?
Wash it.
Yes, that's right, paint it. Bricks are very easy to tint. And let's say we have a situation where bricks are discoloured because they have got wet, because we didn't store them properly, because they've come from wrong batches, because somebody hasn't mixed it from 3 pallets, and we do have a blotchy situation. Perhaps we have a band, we have a rogue batch even. It's always possible to tint bricks. What are the bad practices? Does anybody here do tipping and tailing, such as we've got here? One of the problems is that it's going to hold water. That can freeze, that can expand, that can blow the mortar out. and that can also have damp problems. It can show damp on the brickwork. So we don't do that, although it might be a quicker way of laying bricks, because that can then store water. Similarly, deep furrowing. We can do that very quickly. We can slap down bricks, we can lay very fast, but deep furrowing similarly can cause issues where the bed doesn't have full contact with the brick. We're leaving a void, and that again, that can hold air, can hold water, means the brick is not performing properly. You probably all know this better than I do already. Bricks aren't actually 215 long. They're anything but. They're longer, they're shorter, what have you. We've actually been asked at the BDA what is a reasonable width for a cross joint to make up tolerances. And we have decided, and nobody's disagreed with this, that a 10mm joint shouldn't deviate by more than 50%, i.e. the minimum brick size should be 5 and the maximum brick size should be 15. Quite often on site you see this being exceeded. And the reason for that is people are trying to go from A to B with a given number of bricks, let's say 5 or 6, and actually the bricks are either oversized, which is more common, or undersized, which is less common. And that may be particularly true, of course, of a very tremendous product like yours, Mark, mightn't it?
Yeah, we can see the variation in that sort of thing.
There's a huge variation in those bricks. So you have to be aware of what the tolerance is likely to be on the bricks before you start. And it is useful to know the solutions. I went to a building site yesterday. It was a complex job and the architect hadn't worked out a bonding pattern. And consequently, the bricklayer had to do a very complex series of headers, stretchers, three-quarter bats in order to achieve several bays, to work it all out. And that had cost the bricklayer a great deal of money and time. So you have to be aware of the brick, the tolerances before you start. Tolerances are either T1, T2 or TM. T means manufacturer's tolerance. If you've got a panel and it's just not working out, you can do clever things like perhaps throw in a queen closer or put in a header or something of that nature. But the other thing you can do is cut a brick. You may have to put another brick in or indeed take a brick out if they're undersized or oversized. And the way that you do that is in the panel is you can put a brick down the middle. You cut a brick, a zip course. That's the worst thing to do. The next worst thing to do is to put the bricks at the end of the panel. That can also be seen, though it's better than putting a zip course in. But the best alternative is to put the cut brick balanced at each end of the panel wall where you've cut them, and nobody ever notices that you've cut a brick there. So that's a good solution when you've run into difficulty. Along with tolerances, we've also got range. And if you're interested in working out ranges and thinking there is an issue, I have a problem with this building, this is not working out for me, that's when you refer to PAS 70. And we have summary documents. There's a summary document here, and there are also summary documents on other manufacturers' websites. And don't forget, the manufacturers are there to help you as well. You really should take advice where possible from them. They're not your enemy. Included in my talk and these brochures are some common things that you would know anywhere. A good thing to do is to keep the mortar clear out of the cavity. And you may think, well, this is a fairly academic thing. Does it really matter that there's a mortar in the cavity? Well, I was saying earlier to the earlier group that, in fact, there is involved in a legal dispute at the moment with a Premier footballer's house where the cavity was full of a great deal of debris, which has left to the weep holes being blocked. And this has meant a lot of outstanding money to the bricklayer. So it is important that you do keep snots out of the cavity. It will lead to the wall getting saturated, it will lead to the insulation getting saturated, and it will lead to failure in the building. And along with that would be mortar droppings falling down, blocking the weep holes at the bottom of the cavity trays. Has anybody here ever laid a brick with a frog down? Why did you do that?
Find it easier.
Well, there is a difficulty. The difficulty is this. Here, you've got a full bed. The brick is, the weight is carried over the whole base of the brick. Here you're putting all the weight on these two relatively smaller parts on the outside area. The other thing is you've also got an air pocket in there. And again, this air pocket can collect water. This can leave visible staining on the outside of the brickwork, and it can freeze thaw, expand and cause cracking. So that can be quite an issue. The other thing is you're going to get a much better job if you raise the corners and infill at relatively low lifts in between it, as opposed to doing a huge great corner and then trying to run your lines along, because you're going to struggle. This will not get good quality brickwork. We would say in our document that you shouldn't lay bricks when the temperature is 3 degrees and falling, and you should only recommence laying bricks when the temperature is 3 degrees and rising. This is your work and you ought to protect it, and you've got to protect it from other trades as well, other people who might damage it.